All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session, The Power of Equity in Fundraising. This workshop is offered by the Massachusetts Community Foundations Partnership. As you may know, the partnership is made up of 15 Massachusetts-based community foundations who have come together since the start of the coronavirus pandemic to pool resources to strengthen the nonprofit community. My name is Molly McCaig, and I am the Operations and Membership Manager at the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network. I'm joined today by our presenter, Sonia Shields of Cause Effective, who I'll introduce in a moment, as well as Raisa Ali of Cause Effective, Jessica Holmes of the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, and Kelton Artuso of Philanthropy Massachusetts. Philanthropy Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network are pleased to work with the foundations to bring these resources to the Massachusetts nonprofit community. We are thrilled to be joined by Sonia Shields this morning. Sonia joined the Cause Effective team in 2019 with over 25 years of experience as a nonprofit executive. As a senior associate at Cause Effective, Sonia partners with nonprofit organizations offering coaching and consulting in the areas of fundraising and communications. She also serves as a facilitator for the Cause Effective Fellow Program, Advancing Fundraisers of Color in Fundraising. Sonia is also on the board of directors of the Association for Fundraising Professionals New York, the American LGBTQ Museum, and is a committee member for the Nonprofit New York Excellence Awards. Before we get into this morning's session, I just want to go over a few logistical elements. We ask that you keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you are able to, though, we would love for you to turn your camera on so that we can see who is with us today. I understand that that is not possible for everyone, but we hope that you will engage with us in that way if you are able. We encourage you to share your questions, reactions, and reflections in the chat box throughout the session. And you're also invited to vocalize your questions using the raise hand feature, which you can find by selecting reactions at the bottom of your screen. This is an interactive sessions, and you'll have a couple of opportunities for small group discussion in breakouts as well. And if you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat box at any time. We are making a recording of this webinar and we'll distribute it after with the slides as well. And with that quick intro, I'll turn the presentation over to Sonia.
Thank you so much, Molly. I'm so happy to be here. I've had just the right amount of green tea. I am feeling very energized this morning, which is great. Thank you for that introduction. Yes, I've been in this field for over 25 years. I would say that my sweet spot has been fundraising, marketing, communications, and the intersection of those three key elements that help to build the visibility, engagement, and help to grow nonprofit organizations. And I love this work. I'm passionate about this work, and I love talking about this work. So thank you. I am very honored to be here to talk with all of you. I will go over, and what I would love is if everyone would really utilize the chat. And because there's going to be so many folks in this session today, it would be great if you would just put your name, your title, and your organization in the chat so I can get a really good sense of who's here, so we can all see who's here. And I think that would be a great way to kind of bring us all together. So if you wouldn't mind putting your name, your title, and the organization where you work, or if you are a board member. So let's talk about the agenda today a little bit. The agenda for this session will be broken up into, no, actually, before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about Cause Effective. Can you go to the next slide? So Cause Effective has been around for almost 40 years. We're actually getting ready to celebrate the 40th anniversary. And as Molly said, I've been a part of the team for almost 3 years. This summer will be 3 years. Cause Effective transforms nonprofits by partnering with mission-driven leaders to achieve social change. We work with leadership to develop, employ, and expand effective fundraising, governance, and organizational strategies to advance equity and justice. Cause Effective envisions a future in which nonprofits thrive, empowered leadership, and abundant funding to achieve an equitable world. And I will say that we touch hundreds of organizations every year. Throughout the organization's history, the organization has probably touched over 6,000 nonprofit organizations. And I'm very proud to be a part of the team at Cause Effective. Now, the agenda, next slide. I think it's me, and then the next slide. Yes, thank you. So it'll be 4 parts today. First, I'll sort of talk about the Cause Effective's journey to addressing the tensions around money, power, and race in the development field, and the programmatic work that we launched several years ago to build a pipeline of development professionals of color, and most recently, new programming for nonprofit professionals of color who want to learn fundraising, and a cohort program for executive directors of color as well. The next part of the morning will focus on communications and how to best message your case for support through an equity lens, and how to partner with the board in their fundraising work in an equitable way and ensure that your fundraising strategy is aligned with your organization's values. So let's kick it off by talking about money, power, and race. Next slide. So in 2017, Cause Effective began a survey of the sector and spoke with over 200 fundraising professionals of color from around the country. Cause Effective took on this initiative after years of hearing from directors of development of color that they felt unsupported, isolated, and that they experienced microaggressions and racism in the field. Cause Effective was very much aware of the high turnover of directors of development in the field in general, but observed how many people of color left development altogether after having bad experiences working at nonprofits. Cause Effective wanted to address the issues that directors of development professionals of color experienced and conducted an exploration in the field. Next slide. So I was one of the people that was interviewed, and honestly, I was never asked questions about my experience as a director of development before. No one had ever asked me how I was treated. And the questions brought up a lot of emotions for me. I shared experiences that many of the people who were interviewed had also gone through. And the result of those conversations is the report, Money, Power, and Race, the lived experiences of fundraisers of color. I believe we've provided the executive summary, and the full survey is available on the Cause Effective website. Next slide. Some of the findings from the report included 1/3 of the survey respondents reported that they experienced DEI issues on the job. Of those, 2/3 did not feel supported by their supervisors. 77% of survey respondents acknowledge facing obstacles in their development careers due to their race and ethnicity, but only 22% consider these impediments to be one of the top 3 challenges of their jobs. 88% of the survey respondents said that they would recommend a career in fundraising for a person of color, but also almost 60% acknowledge that they might be reluctant to suggest that people of color they know move into the fundraising profession. Next slide. So some of what was learned from the surveys is that fundraising is a white-dominated space. Discomfort with race and power dynamics equal less effective fundraising. DEI issues are magnified as professionals advance in responsibility. People of color in fundraising must work harder to prove themselves. Microaggressions and implicit bias are common. ED support is essential to people of color navigating DEI issues. And people of color who advance say it's worth the struggle. Next slide. So some of the direct feedback, I'm just gonna recite a few of them, is that when you grow up poor or lower income, it's hard to shake the feeling that you're putting on an act. On top of that, it's hard to reconcile the fact that while the organization as a whole might value DEI and intersectionality, the donor pool definitely doesn't reflect that. Next slide. I find that the advice I give is dismissed or is even as a challenge to authority. It's as if I don't know how to do my job. I felt that my race, ethnicity, and age often led higher ups, board, and other high-level donors to perceive me as the assistant, while my counterparts received more respect and even more time to complete requested tasks. Leadership discounts my role and donors take their lead from them. Next slide. It has always been difficult to work in a white work environment because the common perspective is that it is not a white environment. The lack of awareness of both institutional and personal bias / racism is impossible to change. I've learned how to recognize and identify funder biases and assumptions, as well as learn to bite my tongue and not speak out, as that could lead to disagreements and loss or lack of funding. Fundraising is hard enough, and I had to expend 1.5 times as much energy as a white colleague to do an equal or better job. Next slide. So some of the common challenges include misconceptions about the role, unclear, unrealistic expectations, a sense of isolation, low performance ratings and job satisfaction, high turnover, and additional challenges faced by fundraisers of color, underrepresentation, routinely experienced microaggressions, stereotyping and racism, tokenism, passed over for recognition, authority goes unacknowledged, power is undermined. The report demonstrated the critical need to offer curriculum programming to address these issues, and Preparing the Next Generation program was born, which, as I mentioned earlier, consists of cohorts for development professionals of color, nonprofit professionals of color who want to learn fundraising, and executive directors of color. Preparing the Next Generation incorporates DEI in all the sessions for cohorts, which ultimately makes the nonprofit sector stronger. While many nonprofits address the D in DEI and work toward diversity, which can often feel like tokenism, because the E and the I need more attention. Any nonprofit's ability to sustain its mission and work requires fundraising, and directors of development must be supported and set up for success. So before I go on, I've said I packed a punch with a lot in there. And I just want to, before I get into communications in case, I want to just give a little time for anyone to ask any questions or have any comments about what has been shared so far. Are there surprises about what came out of this report? No surprise. Thoughts, questions? We'd love to hear from you. Oh, so we've got in the chat, clapping along at the D and E come, yes. Yes, I would say that, we know that when DEI became a thing, which has been some years now, that everyone focused on the diversity aspect, hiring people of color, making sure that you have a more diverse staff, a diverse board. But the equity inclusion piece is often not addressed. It's not put into practice. The survey was other professionals of other professionals in the sector in general. It was not just directors of development. They talked to funders as well. Other folks that work closely with directors of development were interviewed too. What happens when you have an intersection? Yes, that's me. I'm queer and I'm Black and I'm a woman. And so trust me when I tell you that I have absolutely worked in some sectors where when I said that I was queer, people were like, so being Black can't hide that, being a woman and being queer. I've experienced it all and I've seen it all. Any other comments, questions? Yes. Someone wrote, I really appreciate the note about not thinking of recognizing a workplace as a white workplace, really sitting with that. Yes. There is a way in which sometimes you can even have a person of color as the executive director of the organization. Or you can have a person of color who is the director of development. And there might be some diversity amongst your staff, but it can still be a space that is dominated by white supremacy. We live in a country where how we all operate within the workplace is something that is so deep, it's so layered, it's so complex that we don't even fully understand it. It's so much to unpack there because we've all been taught to operate in a certain way. And I've absolutely worked for people of color where I have had some of the same challenges working for people of color who were my boss because they grew up in America, that they have been a part of this way in which we work as a culture. Yes, the nonprofit industrial complex. Yes, we've all been conditioned. And the more that we are able to talk about it and have uncomfortable conversations, the better nonprofits will be. Pretending that everything is okay because you have people of color on staff is not enough. Okay, I'm going to continue on. Next slide, we're going to get into communications in case. Okay. So you see the question on the board, on the slide rather. How are race and socioeconomics a part of your donor stewardship messaging, right? So after the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that took place around the country, many nonprofit organizations recognized the need to re-examine their values, vision, and mission, along with their overall communication and messaging. This was an important step for so many organizations because the reality is, from the beginning of nonprofit fundraising, nonprofits have used disempowering, deficit-based language when referring to the needs of marginalized communities. Narrow framing within fundraising messaging that doesn't reflect the layered barriers some communities face, and it creates a disconnect between funders and the communities they aim to serve. Next slide. Save the Children. I should have taken the time to look to see what is Save the Children's annual budget. I could only imagine. Save the Children is an organization that has used poverty porn for over 100 years. And it works. They raise a lot of money. We don't have enough research to compare the approach, in terms of what a poverty porn campaign net looks like and compared to an empowering campaign with background information to educate donors. The reality is poverty porn misrepresents systemic problems. Here's a couple of the lines that I pulled from the Save the Children's website. As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to spread globally, hundreds of millions of children face increasing threats to their safety and well-being, including violence, gender-based violence, exploitation, and separation from caregivers. These threats could be even more severe for children living in countries experiencing instability and conflict. Another line, globally, we ensure that no child's learning stops because they are caught up in a crisis. Caught up in a crisis. I have to repeat that. Globally, we ensure that no child's learning stops because they are caught up in a crisis. Another line, we are the world's leading expert on childhood. The world's leading expert on childhood. We know that people respond to crisis, but what organizations need is recurring support, people who will invest in an organization's mission over the long term. And after the death of George Floyd and BLM protests, many organizations saw an uptick in donations. So many organizations struggled with how to keep people engaged. What we know to be true at Cost Effective is the importance of educating people about the core issues nonprofit organizations address, not watering down their mission and communicating their case for support through a lens, not watering down their mission and communicating their case for support through a lens of equity that addresses systemic issues that have contributed to various forms of oppression, generational poverty, and the wealth divide. To frame your case for support through an equity lens, you begin with your organization's core values. An organization's purpose begins with your core values. It's the heart of the organization. It's what the organization stands for. And your communication strategy through an equity lens is messaging your core values, vision, and mission authentically to reflect the lived experiences of the population you serve or advocate for. Centering the point of view of the population you serve and advocate for is key to equitable messaging. To say that people are poor and not talk about generational poverty is not talking about people fairly. For organizations who work with young men impacted by the criminal justice system, and your messaging communicates that every person deserves a second chance, is misrepresentation. There are tens of thousands of men who are Black and brown in prison because they are a person of color, not because they did anything wrong. Often it's because they could not afford a lawyer. The core values can shape the culture of the organization. In this time that we are living in, core values are so key to your case for support and overall the messaging of the organization. Next slide. So there are some themes, and the themes are, it speaks to when you are fundraising and your fundraising is not equitable. So fundraising campaigns tend to reinforce the social narrative that wealth is the ultimate measure of a person's value, and typically characterize donors as superheroes. When a donor and the money they bring is the star of your story, you're likely to reinforce inequitable structures. A donor-centric story reinforces savior-saved economies that in turn deprioritize, minimize, or mischaracterize the people your work is meant to benefit. It credits the individual as opposed to the collective, which diminishes the value of what we're capable of achieving together. So what I'd like to do is we're going to go into a breakout room. Put the exercise, great, thank you, Raisa. So there are 3 things that you're going to discuss in groups. What is the story your organization is currently telling about participants who are people of color and or the issues that impact people of color? This is a big question. What are the implications for equity in that story? And pick one thing that you might want to change. Okay, Raisa will make sure that these questions are in the chat. And I would like for at least, we can't get to, because we have so many people here, but I would really like for each group to pick someone that will share out the highlights from the conversation, okay? And we're going to give this 20 minutes. All right? Thanks, Raisa.
Molly, are you actually setting up those breakout rooms? Great, thank you.
Welcome back. I like seeing it like this. We decided that we wanted to have it where we can all see each other until I go into the next section. And my hope is that you've elected someone from each group to share out the highlights from the conversation. Not an easy conversation, right? No. And I'm Black.
Same here, Sonia. Same here.
So I can imagine it's not an easy conversation. So who would like to share out first? How many groups did we have? How many groups did we have so we can keep count?
Well, we were in room 8, so.
There were
okay,
10. Sorry about that.
10. Oh, wow. So there were 10 groups. We may not be able to get to all of them, but we really want to hear from you all because this is the reason why we're all here, right?
Go ahead.
Pardon?
Can I go ahead? I'll go ahead.
Sure, perfect. Go ahead.
Group was really good.
Andrew, why don't you also, before you tell me what organization you're with?
I'm with the Authentic Caribbean.
And just so you know, your Wi-Fi is a little choppy. You're going in and out.
Yeah, I don't know what's happening this morning. It's been going in and out. My group was very interesting and amazing, I should say. Great persons in it. We had like South Coast Community Foundation and United Way and myself. And we spoke about how we could, the story that we're telling towards persons of color. And, you know, they looked at how we can improve serving people of color. And myself, I said to them, well, we're serving people of color. And these were some of the stuff that we saw that community of colors needed support. We all agreed on how we can support these communities and look at ways in which we can, you know, level the playing field of equity. What came out of our group too was we spoke about the data, how we can look at data for these various communities. What was good, we had persons who were from the north, Lowell, who were serving those communities in the north, Lowell, that area, and then south, which is New Bedford and so forth. So where's Trisha? Trisha can speak a little bit more on some of the discussion that we were having. Victoria was there too from the Trees organization, and we spoke about how impact of some of the communities that she's serving in terms of tree planting and so forth. Trisha, are you there?
I am. Thanks, Andrew. Good start. Yeah, so we all shared out, you know, the challenges, trying to obtain data. It's not easy right now, you know, filling out forms, applications, the difficulty and the challenges, you know, with a lot of the smaller nonprofits that are working, you know, the grassroots and, you know, the changes that need to be made. We also talked about, you know, how we're all working to change or just be more inclusive with granting, you know, reviewing applications, thinking about, you know, the impact to the community at whole. I don't know. I think that's about it.
I have a couple of follow-up questions because the reason why we do this work is because we want to address a need, an issue, right? There's always a why, and that's most important. But a part of what I want to challenge all of you around is why we're all here today is to be able to communicate that why, to communicate in an equitable way how you are talking about issues that impact people of color. So it's interesting, Andrew, that you immediately went into service, right? You started talking about service. And that's, of course, the reason why you're passionate about the work that you do, because you know, it's all about addressing a need. But I just want to remind everyone that a big piece of this is that narrative. It's about how are you talking about folks of color? What's your narrative around socio and economics? What's your narrative around marginalized communities? Because the more that you are able to get to a place where that language is equitable, where you're through inside the organization, the board, how you're talking with donors, where you get people on the same page around that, the stronger your fundraising is going to become, the stronger your organization is going to become. Because you got to always go back to your values, what your organization stands for, and just keep coming back to your values as much as possible, you know? So, because what happens a lot of times is we just focus on the services and the need, but we don't shape that narrative, which helps to drive more funding to address the need, right? So thank you, Andrew and Trisha. Anybody else from that group want to add anything else? Okay. Second group. Whose hand is raised? Oh, Danielle.
So we're group 7, but I figured I'd just go. We had a really good conversation, and our organizations are all at different places. Some have diverse boards, some feel like they're doing it right, quote unquote, some just starting this conversation. So one of the first things that came up is we all want to do what's quote unquote right, but what does that look like and how? And we talked about some board issues of some have older boards with no term limits, some have released statements, but then what happens after that? For my org, we provide service dogs to deaf adults and autistic kids. My org's based in Oregon originally. Pretty much looks like our client base, we don't believe that people of color exist that are deaf and autistic, which is absolutely ridiculous. So little old me is trying from the bottom to change that. But how do you get buy-in on the whole org that just one person moving it in their own way? What happens if I leave? Like, how do you get that intentionality? Someone's brand identification doesn't match the diversity that they actually have on the ground. And we had one person that's actually working in the farming industry. And that one was really interesting because they were founded to support farmers. But statistically, the farmers have mostly been white people on stolen land. But the people working the farms are not. Very different optics. So they're figuring out how do they still do the work they want to do equitably and address that issue, and not just in a tokenizing way. So they have an intentionally diverse board, and they've started a racial equity fund, and they're trying to figure out how exactly do we distribute this in an equitable way that actually helps people. That's our high level stuff.
Great, Danielle. Really good. Anybody else want to add from that group? Okay, another group, please.
I'm sorry, could I just
Sure.
add a comment? Sorry.
Absolutely.
I work for the Merrimack River Watershed Council, so we have a similar scenario because we have affluent communities, waterfront owners, and then we have urban communities. And a mix of who gets their drinking water from the Merrimack River, which is over 600,000 people. So we have similar challenges as the farm organization. And I really want to thank you for bringing up that starting a racial equity fund, because that could be have some synergy for us too. So thank you.
That's great. Love it.
I'm happy to jump in for our group, and then I'll invite Sharon to add on it. She volunteered to help me out if I miss anything. So it's actually, I'm just reading Joa's comment in the chat, and our discussion really connects well with this comment. So I'd love to tie it back there. Something we discussed a lot was how we discuss the systemic issues behind what issue we're addressing more on the surface. So my organization is focused on the digital divide. And so we talk a lot about, the history and ongoing racist and socially unjust policies that have caused communities of color and low-income communities to be disproportionately affected by the digital divide. And so something that we've been trying to do is incorporate that discussion of the systemic issues that underpin the digital divide in more of our narratives. Something that we discussed in our group was how challenging that can be, especially when the format is very limited. So if you're writing a grant proposal, for example, or a really short communication, and you're asked to explain the issue you're addressing in 100 characters, 100 words, how can you talk about these really complex systemic issues in such a short amount of time? And that's where we run into a lot of the challenges as we're trying to make sure that we're providing the full context behind these issues. So that's something that we sort of shared a common struggle in trying to convey complex issues in sort of short formats that aren't really designed for that.
I'm so appreciative that you said that, Alyssa. I mean, isn't it interesting that it shows you I'm just going to say it, the power of some of these foundations, okay? And how we are like so having to be flexible to trends and how they are dictating philanthropy. And I remember, 20 something years ago when I started in my career, I started in direct mail and telemarketing. I was writing, campaigns and then I moved up, and then I started getting into grants. And I remember, I could just write, there was no limitation. You just write a proposal and definitely the character limitation is real. And so what I have done and working with people and have suggested is just come out swinging, come out strong with your vision and mission statement, very upfront, very bold, elevate the data as much as possible, really get to the problems in a very concise way as quickly as possible. And I have seen for several organizations it being very effective. I mean, it takes time, a lot of back and forth with one organization that I have worked with in the past couple of years. It took a lot of time to get that narrative as concise as possible, but it worked because the reality is a lot of the people that are reading these proposals aren't really reading the proposals. So you've got to come out swinging, and you got to come like very, very bold. Don't water it down. Yeah. I mean, you just got to be as concise and bring the data as strongly as possible.
And just to jump in, I mean, Alyssa really spoke very well to it, and thank you for. Of course, that's my mom calling me because I'm no longer on mute. But anyway, so
good song choice. It was a good song choice, though.
Let's it's my mom. That's important. So is the challenge of also reframing the questions that were asked. One of the challenges. I mean, the shorthand, the language that's used to describe, I work for Groundwork Lawrence in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Lawrence, Massachusetts is frequently and all too often described as one of the poorest communities in the Commonwealth. And every funder that we speak with, that's from a grant as opposed to individual funders, but even in our individual funders, ask us about the demographics of our community. And stepping away from that in a way that comes out strong and that speaks to the thing, Sonia, that you mentioned, is one of the challenges. The questions that were asked means that we really have to work hard to change the way the narrative is framed, because they're perpetuating the sort of superiority of philanthropy to begin with. And so we're already at a disadvantage because we're asking for funds with pride, not out of pity. Right. And to be able to reframe it that way, for those of us that deal in language, can be a challenge because we're given 1,000 characters or 100 words, or give me the percentage. And so it's this double-edged bind because we're all in here really committed to making this change, both for the communities we serve and for the way that we support them. I find sometimes being able to fight that limitation or the questions that are being asked is infuriating. But we're working on it.
Yeah, it's a game I feel that you're playing for sure. And it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable because you want to provide more context, more background, right? And then you're trying to figure out what's the most compelling thing that I need to say with this much space to say it. It makes you feel like, are they really committed or not? But yeah, it is infuriating. And especially if that's not your writing style. A lot of people have to really learn a whole new way of communicating, I find as well. Anyone else want to add to that point? Okay, next group. Who can share out some highlights from your conversation?
I'll share on the behalf of my group. We were in group 6, and we had a great conversation. We discussed that we think we're doing fairly okay with doing the equity piece for the people we're serving. But we want to bring that equity piece more to people kind of outside the organization, board members, people who are doing peer-to-peer fundraising, to make sure if we're doing peer-to-peer fundraising that people who are not great at fundraising or don't have that rich connection have the opportunity to participate in something like the Boston Marathon. So kind of making it equitable all around so that we kind of gather that culture in the entire organization. And if I left something out for my group, feel free to jump in.
Who else was in that group? Anyone else have anything to add?
Hi. Yes, hi, I'm Anna. I was in group 6 with Shakira, and we were talking about how sometimes, or most of the time, grant language, like the language in the applications can come off as like belittling and limiting and
Come off as what?
Belittling.
Okay.
Or condescending. And I guess it goes back to that point of, what makes a community marginalized. And I shared that as someone who works at a public health organization. We focus a lot on the social determinants of health and not just access to healthcare. And the way that my organization in particular is trying to combat that is by creating a health equity fund in which we are asking for unrestricted dollars from individuals specifically to steer away from what grants can limit us, not only in the way that we have to fulfill their needs, to get the funding, but also just kind of the language used. And we are, the organization I work at is focused on dismantling white supremacy culture and structural racism. So it's really what we are about. And we want that message to be clear to people who are interested in investing in what we do, just kind of focusing on joining something that is bigger than all of us, and that it should not be limited to, where you live or where you come from.
Thank you very much, Anna. Anyone else want to add to that? Let's have one more group share out, please. Anyone?
I can go. We were group 5. I'm Sydney Monstream Class. I work with Reach Out and Read Rhode Island, and also I'm a board chair of Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence. And one of the things, we talked in a lot of different ways, but one of the things that I specifically talked about in it's all about my own privilege, in the sense of, like, I realized I was really uncomfortable when I started talking about racism in grants and putting that in there and making sure that funders are hearing that this is a systemic problem. But I was nervous to put it in because I was worried how the funders would react, and was that going to limit our funding? And so I was aware of how uncomfortable it made me feel as a white woman, just talking about this and saying, funders, you need to be aware of this, and this is something that we're addressing. But I feel like the more people who are able to include that, the more the funders need to hear from organizations that if they're uncomfortable with that, then good, then that's a place they need to be. We also talked about our concerns with sort of the trendiness of issues, and knowing that some of our corporate donors particularly are really happy to support our DEI work. But what will happen in a couple of years? Will they kind of go, okay, we did that, great, we can move on, and not recognize that there is an infinite amount of work that needs to be done, that's needs to continue forever. So I'm a little nervous for that, but we just talked about keeping those conversations and that communication happening, so that hopefully donors will become more comfortable with those discussions, and that we're going to continue to address this and not just move on to whatever is the next important issue to address.
Thank you so much, Sydney. When I was fundraising, when that was a big part of my job every day, a big part of my job, I certainly did not feel comfortable having these kinds of conversations with funders, right? I definitely didn't. It's open over the years that I have been able to evolve in this way, and I still do fundraising, but it's not as a director of development anymore. But I will say that I admire a number of executive directors who have been so bold around not taking some funding from different foundations, individuals, and corporations because they didn't share the same values of their organizations. And I've really admired organizations that have been unapologetic around their values and what they stand for. And I can tell you that there's a number of them that it's really worked for them, because I feel like we have got to get more into a community-centric way of fundraising and move away from this donor-centric way of fundraising, where these funders and donors are holding all the power and they're telling us, what the priorities should be, because that has to come from the bottom up. It has to come from the community. And when you feel so, and I'm going to get into it more in the next part of this conversation, where you feel so beholden to a funder or a donor. So I would just say to all of you that the more that you're able to have those kinds of conversations where you're truly educating a donor about or a corporation or funder about what it really means to invest and partner over the long term, that's going to benefit you. It's going to benefit you because your job is to really educate them, not for them to educate you in most instances, right? So I really appreciate you saying that. And I know how challenging that can be, but the more courageous all of you are around that, the stronger your organization will be, because you know that you're going to be also aligned with your values, which is most important as well. So I'm going to continue to the next section because we have two more parts before we part today. Raisa, can you share the screen again? This section is about organizing a board for fundraising equity. Okay. So we all know that the staff are often ahead of the board in terms of what it means to run a proactively anti-racist organization. Boards are often focused on compositional diversity, corporate America is so focused on numbers. So while many organizations have increased their desire to engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and that work must extend to their board of directors as well. Because the board of directors are crucial in the organization's DEI work because they serve as a reflection of an organization's values and belief. The DEI work is more than having a diverse staff. It's important to actively examine processes that have existed that perpetuate a structure that may not be based in equity. This process of evaluating your DEI practices extends to fundraising as well. So when we think about the role of the board of directors in building fundraising equity, this is where an organization can truly set the tone. Most organizations say they want to have a diverse board, but then they have a give-get of 10K and think that everyone should have the ability to raise and get at the same level. And too often, people of color are discussed as a challenge to find. The narrative is way too often, it's so hard to find people of color to join the board who can contribute and have networks for fundraising. So who is leading the conversation at the table, and how are the decision-making power distributed at the table, right? The board structure is often top-down, where the people with the deepest resources are at the top. And then quite often, other board members are not so supported for success. I've seen this time and time again, okay? You've got all of the people with the deeper pockets, with the access at the top. You know, they're making a lot of the decisions, and other folks that may not have as much resources, don't have those kinds of networks, they're not holding any seats, and they're also not supported. They're not set up for success. Boards are one way the organization brings those outside of the inner circle into a position of guidance over the organization's future. This is why who's at the table is so critical. This table partners with staff leadership. The board should be partnering with staff leadership to determine the organization's narrative and then work in partnership to achieve how to execute in the most equitable way. Next slide. So there are a couple of components to this in terms of like how a board can move towards equity. So overall, they need a plan. And one of the first plans is they need to know what is expected of them, right? One of the main expectations is fundraising. So a board should have their own plan to conduct fundraising equity that is based on the strengths of the board from various backgrounds, which means various levels of fundraising, reach, and capacity. If a basketball team scores 120 points, it's not the case that each 10 members scores 12 points. Some will score 40 points, some barely score at all, but they play good defense. Everyone has their role so that the time as an aggregate scores those 120 points. Everyone is playing their part with excellence, and together those parts add up. Board fundraising should be like that. Not everyone does the same thing, but everyone is participating with their strengths. This means that you don't do a one-size-fits-all prescription for board member fundraising participation. Key staff works with the fundraising committee and each board member to assess the fundraising assets they bring to the table, and they make a plan that staff can support. Board members need buddies for accountability. To build individual board leadership means that board members hold each other accountable. One way to do this is each board member has an accountability buddy that they check in with. And it's an important way to ensure that everyone is carrying their weight. The other question that needs to be asked is, what are you valuing in board leadership? And besides board fundraising, besides money, what else is your organization valuing? Next slide. So leadership, right? The development of board leadership and fundraising equity is a partnership between the board and the staff. There should be an ongoing process to onboard board members that is in partnership with key staff. The board members are volunteers. They are not in the office, and they need ongoing support. What do they need to do the job, to stretch? Key staff should be make it interesting for them. Give them what they need to do the job. Don't assume that they know how to do the job. The staff must help them to stretch. Next slide. The board needs to examine their structure. Is it top down? Is it equitable? Are there multiple points of entry? Many ways to contribute as a board member? Or does your board value only people who contribute money and can raise big gifts? Time is the only resource we cannot make more of, and thus the donation of time must be valued as much as the donation of money. Are you creating an opportunity for all board members to shine? Board leadership should be fluid, changing, collective over time. The board has to groom people as opposed to who wants to be the chair and then given the position to the last person standing, or the chair stays way too long. Board leadership and the ED have to be thinking at least 2 years out at the same time as you're managing what's going on presently. Thinking about who are you bringing in, who are you cultivating. It needs to be an ongoing process. So we're going to go into our last breakout room. And this one, next slide. Oh, great. Thank you, Raisa. You're on it. The questions are, what have you been doing in the area of fundraising that enables board members from all walks of life to participate robustly in the fundraising process? What are you valuing besides money raised? And what's the next step for your board in creating an equitable leadership environment? Those are the questions for this conversation. And Raisa will put them in the chat and she will move you into breakout rooms. We'll come back and share out. And then we have another little small portion before we end for the morning, okay? Welcome back. Hi, we actually only have such a short period of time. At first I thought we might end early, but I really appreciate the last conversation and everything that was shared. So I have one section left that I want to definitely get into. So I will ask for like maybe 1 or 2 people to provide a highlight from that conversation. Please, someone nominate yourself to share out.
I don't mind doing that. I'm sorry, I'm not on camera. I'm Danielle Brown from the Northampton Survival Center. And I just wanted to say something. So I've just joined my organization and I'm meeting my development committee tonight for the first time and my board on Thursday for the first time. So I'm very, very new. But one thing that I think the org is doing really well that I'm very excited about is we have created a client advisory committee that both helps inform our programming, but is also a pipeline to the board. So we're very specifically recruiting folks at all income levels and of all backgrounds to join our board, and also trying to remove as many barriers as possible in doing that. So we provide stipends for things like technology resources or childcare, anything that might be a barrier to your serving on a committee or on the board. And all of this, of course, happened before I got here, but the board has been really supportive about creating streams of funding specifically for that, for the recruitment and the retention of a very diverse committee and board. And that's just a thing that I'm really looking forward to being a part of.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. Love it. That's really, really great. Especially having a fund for people, if you're a national or regional organization, for travel, especially, you know, there's some people who might want to serve on the board, but don't have the resources for travel. And yeah, I think that just unpackaging what equity looks like, you know, is such a big piece in terms of like, you know, the whole give, get, and, you know, and valuing people that can raise money. And you really have to start valuing people that can contribute it in lots of other ways. Anyone else want to share? One more person.
I know I shared before, and I'll just share one really quick example that as regarding a board chair position that I have with Rhode Island Coalition Against Gun Violence, and we are fully volunteer at this point, and we have a diverse board for sure, you know, including survivors of gun violence. And one person in particular who lost her daughter to gun violence is now an artist. And so one way she contributed really beautifully is she created this incredibly moving, beautiful piece of artwork that we did pay her for, but then we utilized that on our fundraising appeal, and we made cards out of it. And so that was sent out to, not all of our membership, but a portion of it, just because it was expensive to do. And so people got to see this piece of artwork that was really moving. And then of course, on the back of the card, she had an artist statement and a piece about the art. So it was helpful for her too, for people to see who she was. And she's a new board member. But it was really a beautiful way for her to contribute her talent to the board in something, I'll show you, that she created. And it's beautiful, and there's her information on the back, and our appeal inside, and
nice.
But it was a way that she was able to do something that really reached a lot of people and was really moving
and fulfilling for her, and made her feel purposeful, I'm sure. So thank you. In the essence of time, I'm going to have Raisa share the screen for this last section. I want to leave a little bit of room for us to wrap up. So aligning fundraising and organizational values is what this section is about. Fundraising dynamics can create situations where you feel beholden to a donor or a funder that doesn't share the same values as your organization. Sometimes organizations experience tensions around power play. A donor or a funder makes unreasonable demands. Sometimes issues come up around race, like donors who had issues with organizations aligning with Black Lives Matter movement. Sometimes donors and funders have requests that have to do with how you deliver your programs and services. This can be particularly unsettling because your organization's mission and the population that you work with are the priority. And you have to keep coming back to your organization's values. Your organization's values should drive everything that you do. Your organizational values should drive how you conduct fundraising and how you engage with donors. Your goal is to create opportunities for donors to further their understanding of the complexity of your work, the complexity of the issues that impact the community. And you want to respectfully, push back when donors do or say things that may be detrimental to your work or to your community. And you really must be as honest as you possibly can with your donors about the resources that it takes to comply with their wishes and to maintain relationships with them. And you must push back when it becomes excessive. And you must never adhere to a donor's wishes if it ever comes at the expense of the community. You must be able to walk away from donor relationships if you are putting the organization's values in question. The more your organization aligns your fundraising with organizational values, the stronger your organization will be positioned to raise more money, have transformational donor relationships instead of transactional donor relationships. And the better position you are to truly build a culture of philanthropy, because building a culture of philanthropy is really about everyone being on the same page and embracing your organization's values and mission and being an enthusiastic ambassador at every level of fundraising throughout your organization. It means creating an environment where gifts of any size are valued, and there are multiple ways of the entire team to engage in fundraising. Everyone holds the power of the organization's narrative and case for support. A culture of philanthropy means everyone is representative in your organization. Okay, and I am going to end there and leave room. You can unshare the screen for us to just chat for a few more minutes with any takeaways, questions. Thank you for being so active in the chat earlier. I did read everything. And everyone is going to get this recording, correct?
Yes, correct.
Cool, perfect. Perfect. Questions, comments, last thoughts, highlights, aha moments.
Sonia, I just want to say this was really great. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
I was able to meet with a lot of different organizations that sometimes we as a small organization don't even know of. So that was a big plus. And the effort of, the thing about board, really making the board member really work. That's really something that yeah. I think most of us are struggling with some of our board members being active. So
No, that is an ongoing struggle. That's a global struggle.
Sonia,
Yeah.
this is Sharon from Groundwork Lawrence. I just wanted to first reiterate the thank you. And also, as I shared with my group, the thing that you had said about all of the conversations were really helpful and sort of inspiring. But the piece in the board section, when you said, take a look at the power structure of the board, is there an inherent inequity just in how your board is established? Who are the people that are sitting at the top of the board? And I think Groundwork Lawrence is very fortunate. We have a very active, very involved and diverse, but not as diverse as it should be board that's dedicating themselves to a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging subcommittee. We're asking ourselves to do the work, but I don't know if we've asked ourselves that question. And that really, as I shared with my group, really resonated. And I'm going to take a deep breath and bring it back because I think it's going to be difficult. But I also think that even if the answer is we're doing a great job with that, it's a question that every board should ask itself. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. It's, I grew up in America, right? Okay. And I have worked for so many nonprofits. I was a director of development for 5, and I was a chief officer for external relations for a big organization for 7 years, where I had a bigger role. I've been on boards. I'm on 3 now. I was trained a certain way, the power was at the top. And then you had all this frustration about all the other people that you felt like they weren't carrying the weight. And some years ago, it occurred to me like, wait a minute, like I'm expecting for someone who doesn't have the same fundraising chops, cannot keep up with everything that's going on within my department. I'm expecting for them to be able to, as a board member, to stay toe to toe with me and my team and have, access, to bring people to the gala. Okay, we're having this party. You need to give to year end, like expecting for people who don't necessarily have those networks, who are well-intentioned, who really want to give back, but we weren't valuing and we weren't playing to their strengths. We weren't meeting them where they are. And I switched that. It was like late 90s where I was working for an organization. I said, wait a minute, I need to switch this approach. And I started having one-on-one engagements with every board member and really transform that board into becoming a fundraising board, because I met with each person. What does a stretch gift look like for you? If that stretch gift was $250, for some people, $250 is a stretch gift. And okay, so now how can you play a role in fundraising? And then working with each person around what they could potentially do. And literally by the time I left that organization, everyone was fundraising, everyone was carrying their weight, and it became a fundraising board by just meeting people where they are. Anyone else in our last few minutes together?
I just want to make a comment that I was recently in a webinar. I actually don't even remember who was hosting it, so I wouldn't have named them anyway, but I don't remember. And someone was in the chat asking questions about equity and fundraising, the relationship between the board and socioeconomics and equity, and the presenter flat out ignored the questions, like just went past them. And there were a bunch of us in the chat sort of like, can you please address this? Can you please answer it? And people trying to speak up. And I just really appreciate the like laser focus of this session and creating a space for this conversation, which I think in broader sort of fundraising and board role and fundraising trainings that I've been to is either ignored or only partially addressed. So thank you. And I'm going to send the recording to the person who asked that question who isn't here today.
Thank you. I mean, this is all like unlearned behavior for all of us. Somebody put in the chat about the word serve. I say serve all the time. I need to stop saying serve, because I know that there are other ways to talk about how we're partnering with communities without saying that we're serving communities. We got to stop saying that. There's a lot of words we've got to stop saying. And it's not easy. You know, we often take shortcuts. How can we, you know, we're writing a pitch or a case for support or proposal, and we take shortcuts. But it's not serving, here I say serving, it's not supporting communities in the way that we need to. It's not educating quite often funders and donors in the way that we need to. And we just all have to push ourselves, and we have to have difficult conversations with our board, with other leaders, with funders and with donors. And the more that we create this viral effect in the nonprofit sector around this, take the power back, first of all, you know, make it more equitable and not feel like we are beholden to funders and donors, the stronger the sector will be. We should be partnering with funders and donors. It should be a partnership that's transformational, not transactional. Okay. And with that, we can wrap. And Raisa, why don't you put on the screen our information at Cause Effective? Because we absolutely always want to stay in touch. We are here. We have resources that you can also find on our website. My email address. I can just thank you, Raisa. So the last, yeah, there we are. So please find us. That's our website address. We're on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook. We're also on Instagram. The Instagram is not there. And that is my email address. And I will hope to, at some point, connect with some of you again. Just say, I heard you talk in that workshop on fundraising equity. And because of that conversation, we were able to raise more money. That would be great. So thank you, everybody. Have a really great rest of the day, week, happy spring, and all that stuff.
Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.